Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mindset, Heartset, Reset, our dynamic live weekly show that provokes introspection, cultivates compassion, and sparks positive change. I'm super excited to have you join us live, or if you've come in afterwards on the recording, welcome to this incredible show that we're going to have today. As usual, through our insightful discussions, through practical strategies, through authentic stories, through the beautiful guests that we have who are incredibly knowledgeable and also heart-centered. We are nurturing your mindset. We are opening up your heart set and giving you the courage to hit the reset button on your life. So we're so happy to have you join us. Our mission is to expand love on a global scale and to create a world in which all can thrive. I am your host, Dr. Roshan Akashmian. I'm a computational clinical and behavioral neuroscientist and an executive consultant. I am so excited to help in whatever way that I can individuals and businesses to optimize. And that means to really bring yourselves to the most elevated version of who you are. And this show is part and parcel of that intention. And that is that as today we'll talk about loss and healing, that we can move through whatever happens to us in our lives, manage the losses that we are encountering, the joys and the happiness, and bringing all of that together to optimize for our fulfillment and what we bring forth of the gifts, blessings, and talents that we have. And that helps us to achieve as much as we can. I'm super excited to bring you another wonderful episode that we have as part of our mental health series. Mental health is so important because it connects to everything that we do, our decision-making, our relationships, how we show up in the world, etc. And so part of our mental health series today, I'm bringing to you an episode with Barri Leiner Grant, whom we'll introduce in just a moment, to discuss loss and grief. The episode is called Living with Loss, Embracing Grief and Finding Hope. And Barri is absolutely incredible with this. She runs something known as the memory circle. And, everybody experiences grief in their lives because everybody experiences loss in one way, shape, form, or another. Now, of course, when we think of loss, we think of it in terms of losing a loved one, whether that's something that's expected or otherwise. The death of a lost one a loved one is profoundly impactful on us. And we will learn about how to manage that on both a neurobiological level as well as a psychosocial level. We experience breakups, divorce. We experience loss in so many ways because life is ever changing. That's nature. It's always in flux. Stasis is death. So where there is change, that means we're gaining something, but we're also losing something. And very often people think of loss as just, well, somebody passed away or I lost my pet, they passed away. And that's the only time that I need to grieve. Whereas grieving really comes with the loss of whatever it is. Maybe it's a great thing, you're having a baby. And so there's so much to celebrate, but there's also things you're going to lose with that, right? Or you're getting married, but there's also things you're going to have to give up with that. So this idea of being able to connect to loss, I believe, is quite universal. And so I'm very excited for us to be bringing this up, in particular because, as we said in our last week's show, there's so much vicarious trauma going on. We are inundated with a world that is in tremendous flux, and this can be overwhelming to our systems. It's difficult for us to cope. And so when we are discussing that, we also can feel the loss of the systems we relied on. I was just talking to a friend the other day who's just upset about what's happening in her country. And so, we experience loss on multiple levels, and I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through today's show. Okay, so without further ado, I would love to introduce you to our beautiful guest, Barri Leiner Grant. I'm going to bring up her bio and tell you a little bit more about her. She is absolutely extraordinary. So Barri Leiner Grant is the Chief Grief Officer and founder of the Memory Circle, an initiative dedicated to supporting individuals navigating loss. After transitioning from her career as a reporter, Barri fully embraced her role as a grief coach and educator, driven by personal experience and profound commitment to aiding others. Her work is deeply personal, inspired by the loss of her mother, Ellen, in 1993, and is aimed at providing the kind of support she once needed. A certified grief specialist, Barri has honed her expertise with the tutelage of notable figures such as Claire Goodwill Smith, Hope Edelman, and David Kessler. Integrating her journalistic skills with yoga and meditation certifications, she offers a unique approach to grief coaching. Barri's methods include hosting therapeutic circles and personalized sessions that utilize her innovative grief tending techniques. Her contributions to the field have been recognized in major publications like the Washington Post and Psychology Today, and she's made appearances on several award-winning podcasts, TV shows, and radio programs. And now she's here. Barri is also a devoted mother to her daughters Emma and Quinn and lives in New York with her husband Alex and their dog Bean. She continues to guide individuals and organizations in developing compassionate practices to better support those in mourning. We are so honored and excited to have Barri join us. Welcome, Barri, to Mindset, Heartset, Reset.
Hi, Roshanak. It's so good to be here, to be with you. I love getting briefy with you because you so get it.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Okay, let's jump right in. Welcome, everybody. Barri, let's start with the definition of grief. I spoke a little bit about grief and loss, but I'd love you as a specialist, as a certified specialist in grief, to tell us, what does loss mean? What does grief mean? And then maybe differentiate that from mourning, if you would.
A little bit, yeah. I always say that grief is a normal response to any major loss, death and non-death. The process of the emotional life adjustments that we have is the outward expression of grieving as a verb. I always say it's a verb. Lots of us think that grief only pertains to death, loss, right? But bereavement is really the grief that we experience after the death of a loved one. I always say loss is whenever something in life, as you mentioned, when you experience a change in that what you imagined would be in your future does not turn out the way that you envisioned.
I'm sorry. I have such a talent for speaking into a muted microphone. Y'all don't know. But I'm not going to grieve that, okay? That is not a big loss because we can recover from that. So speaking of recovering, so tell me, can you please help us understand better what mourning is? When we have a loss and then we grieve that loss, and then tell us about how mourning fits into that.
So we've lost as a society a lot of the mourning practices that we had that were tradition. Mourning is the outward expression of what you do when you are grieving a loss. So maybe it is a ritual of some sort, for everything from having a funeral to lighting a candle to gathering together in memorial. There are these, again, outward, it's what you do outwardly to create any kind of remembrance for usually the death of a loved one. Although we have created and crafted many mourning experiences for non-death losses. You know, there are people who have celebrations, believe it or not, around being divorced. You know, they have some kind of an experience or an expression where they can be witnessed in moving through this change or some kind of finality in their life. And so, again, the interesting thing is that when we say something is like a normal or normative, because I always say normative because I don't even know what normal is, we all have a different way of expressing. And so many of us have been taught that there are stages of grief. And I want to get into that because there's a lot that people have learned over time or not learned over time. maybe from their own personal experience. Maybe their family grieves a certain way, and that's the expression that you saw of grieving and the outward expression of mourning, and that's what you learn to be normative. I believe what you do for yourself that feels like you're accepting the loss is really, sometimes something happens to us, right? And we don't have control over that, like the sudden death of a loved one. But the way that we meet the death of that loved one with that mourning process, with that ritual, with the way that we express emotion, that is, of course, in our purview to make those kind of choices that work for us.
Thank you so much for that. So, okay, let's get right into it then. So you talked about the mourning process and how we have that mourning process modeled for us. So one of the things that we are lacking these days, oh my gosh, one of the things that we are lacking these days is rituals. Rituals are different than habits. So habits, and I teach this all the time, habits are in the unconscious brain, and they're developed by the brain so that we can be very efficient, as I was talking about, working in optimization, so we can be really efficient about how our brain is paying attention to what it needs to pay attention to, and not something that you've done over and over and over again. That becomes a habit. So it's unconscious. Ritual is that same patterned behavior, but done consciously. Mm-hmm. And what it does is to effectively transform energy. Like, for example, coming of age, there might be a ceremony or a celebration. Weddings, we have the ceremony and the celebration. Death, we have the ceremony, and in some cultures, the celebration. It's important to go through these rituals because they bring us into the present moment and connecting to what is happening now that is a transition of what was happening before. And that gets into the neurobiology of grieving. Mm-hmm. So let me bring that up first, because I think if we keep that in mind as we go through what we're talking about, it might be very helpful to our listeners. So there are three dimensions. There are three ways in which your brain connects to another person in your experience of that person. And that is in time, that is in space, and that is in emotional connection or attachment. So in space, we know where somebody is or where they will be, would be, what they're doing. In time, we know how long it would take to be able to connect to that person. And the emotional or the attachment that we have, that emotional bonding that we have to that person, is our connection to them. And all three of these go through the brain and are mapped in the brain. When you and I were speaking before, we talked about that restructuring that I always say is so important, because we have to restructure the architecture of our lives, but we also have to restructure in our brains. Mm-hmm. So this is a real biopsychosocial event. And the big problem that happens is that our logical brain can understand the time and space thing, right? If somebody passes away, then we know that in time and in space, they're gone. We get that. We can't access them, etc. But especially depending upon the level of emotional attachment that we have to that person, that's the part that we have issue with. And there's real pain in the brain. Our pain centers process the loss of a person with pain physically. We have it because physical and emotional pain are processed similarly in the brain. So that's real. And when we think about people, we have them in our mind through memories, right? We have experiences with them. And those experiences, it's called episodic memory, that we recall those experiences that we have with that person, depending on how many experiences we have, etc. We have an implicit understanding and an implicit presence of that person within us. But when they die, we still have the episodic memory. We still have this sort of desire or drive to connect to that person because we still have that powerful emotional bond that is searching for them. And so that is part and parcel of the problem that we have, because grief, many of you, if not most of you, haven't heard this, and it's very true. Biologically speaking, is a process that is connected to motivation. It is a motivational act because we are seeking for that person or that animal or that thing that is no longer present in time space. But the connection to it is still there. So uncoupling the logical brain of time space with our emotion and our attachment to that person and these memories and their implicit presence, that's the trick biologically, or a great strategy to be able to healthfully, in a healthy way, go through the process of managing the loss of a loved one, a death. And so let's come back to ritual. What does ritual do for us? It allows us to be present to where they are in time space, but create a new process for them, a new presence or absence of them with respect to our emotional attachment. And so we don't have to pretend they weren't as important to us. We don't have to change our love for them, not at all. And grieving isn't about having less love, right? It's about being able to remap that emotional attachment to a new truth of their absence in space-time, or where we know they are in space-time. So when we go through the process of mourning and having rituals, that is incredibly important. Now we know the biology of what happens when we do that, to being able to come to that differential, this new paradigm that we need to create, this new model for how we are connecting to our loved ones. So mentors help us to understand and go through that grieving process. People that we can connect to, friends and family, or grief counselors, help move us through that. And you're so good at this. I learned this from you first, Barry, when you're talking to someone who's grieving the loss of someone, you ask them, what's their name? And then we talk about them. And so that brings them up in a way that is healthy, but connects to us in a safe way. Because when I'm talking to you, Barry, I feel love and connection. I feel safe. So I can safely bring up without the threat and the fear and all that goes with loss of this loved one who's no longer there. So I set this up for the sort of biopsychology, and I'd love to go through and the sociology of why we need rituals and what rituals do and what elders do for us, and the importance of this and the modeling that you just mentioned. Okay, I threw a lot out there. Go.
Things that I think of just by parsing the word remember, which you said, right, in which we remember
We remember.
and spirit, is that we have to remember, which is like all of the ways we are putting them back in our life in a way that we can move forward with their memory. We are remembering ourselves, right? Putting ourselves back together in a way where we have all of this pain and hurt and we can feel quite broken, right? We're remembering. We're also no longer out there, that is in our biology to go seek our loved ones. Like we're always like, where are they now? Like, we feel like we have to go out and find them. It takes a very long time for, as you said,
Absolutely.
good sense of like, where are they now? And how can I learn to live with this loss with their absence. So we don't have to, you'll hear a lot of people say acceptance, right? We don't have to accept that they have died, but we have to come to some kind of an acceptable way of
Well, hold on. Biologically, our brain does accept that have died, that they're dead. Our brain accepts that. That's the logical brain. That person is now dead. However, you're right about we're looking for them. This is the part that we have a real problem with.
the grieving brain, the grieving.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. So
Yeah.
please.
No, I just think what we don't realize is that we are a society that, wants to get down and dirty with like, give me how I get over this. Because sitting in that muck, sitting in that pain, sitting in the idea that this person will no longer be a part of my life moving forward just sounds like if I have to sit in this awful moment forever, if you don't know where there's going to be an ending, you're sort of looking for a solution, a fix, a way forward. And the good, the bad, or the indifferent is that there is no one way or right way, even within a family, even culturally. If you've all been brought up with the same religion, rituals, you may be grieving very differently. You may have a parent that their outward grief, their mourning shows up in tears, right? They're crying. Somebody else may be very, very quiet. Others may find an incredible relationship by continuing to talk to their loved one. There's all kinds of expressions that we have. The experience of a death loss is also the experience of what we call bereavement, the process and range of emotion that we go through as we grieve. That's the bereavement process. We throw around all of these words and we throw around all of these ways in which society has told us that we should grieve. So one of the things that I wanted to get to right away is that the beautiful work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the 5 stages of grief. So many of you probably know them as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So when we talk about that word acceptance, that perhaps the brain may have accepted, as you said, but emotionally, it's very difficult for us to accept. So we take this construct, if you will, that Kubler-Ross created really for stages that people who had a diagnosis that was a clinical diagnosis that was for end of life, the stages that they were going to go through to accept that this diagnosis was in fact something that they would die from. She noticed that these stages showed up for them, and a lot of people adapted and accepted these for, let me go through these stages and check these boxes, and by the time I get to acceptance, I will be done grieving. We all know that, especially in a death loss, the loss of a loved one, we will grieve them for the rest of our lives. We won't always be in as much pain and suffering as we are in active grief, in perhaps the beginning years of grief, but in that process of moving forward, I'm sorry to say that there are no boxes to check, and there is no one way or right way to grieve, but there is that way in which we move through what I call grief tending techniques, and you have to suss what works for you. There are many and many rituals in which we can remember our loved one lost. Especially in a death loss, we need to find ways in which we can create what I call what has been called a continuing bond. This continuing bonds theory is, how do I move forward with them in my life, without them in my life, but with them in my memory.
So I would like to bring your attention to this comment that we have here. It's very relevant. I thought I was done grieving and accepted and made peace with it, but apparently not, because I'm manifesting negative crap. I love this.
I,
Thank you, NJB, for the comment. Can you speak to that and this idea of taking responsibility? I know guilt. So a lot of us can go through guilt and say, if I had only done this thing differently, they would still be here. If I had only done that thing, if I hadn't done this thing, if I hadn't done that thing, then things would be different. And that's really dangerous, because guilt actually is giving us this false notion, this lie, that we have more control than we actually do have. Control, anyway, I always say, is an illusion. Power is incredibly real and our birthright, but control is an illusion, and we don't control outcomes. We can influence, perhaps. Certainly, we put our energy into something, we will be putting that influence into the mix, and we are part of the ingredient of whatever it is that's coming out. But to think that we can actually control, we don't even control. Somebody can, people can say, oh, I'll show you control, and if you hold a gun to someone's head and you pull the trigger, then you've killed them. Well, actually, there are people who have been at point blank shot and they're alive and they're functional, or there are people who were in, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but there was a person who was not at the World Trade Center who was supposed to be there at 9/11, and then a few months later died away in a freak ferry accident, here. So we can't control, we don't know. And saying that I feel guilty or I'm manifesting is, I think, an unfortunate harm that we do to ourselves, and it's not in the way of truth. So I'm wondering, could you please speak a little bit also to that?
yeah, I was just going to say, interrogating whether or not that really is the truth, right? We can only look back at a situation in hindsight and say, if I had only, right? Maybe if I had been, I'll use myself as an example. My mom died quite suddenly. She was at the beach. She was by herself. She had a brain aneurysm. I often thought, well, what if I had been there? What could I have done? And so rewriting and reimagining that day. Sometimes in the early stages, the early years, this is 30 years ago, I thought that too. How could I have changed the circumstance? Some kids will, lie awake at night and think, if I had just been better, if I had been better behaved. We think of all of these ways in which, if our behavior had changed, that we could have changed the outcome. And I think that goes back to acceptance, right? Sometimes we have to accept, is that the truth? Is that really the truth? Would that have made a difference? And now that it is final, really what that is just crafting anxiety, because we have that, I always say, what thoughts are on loop in your mind's eye, if I had only, right? We don't have control over rewriting what ending it was, but I do say there are ways that the body can respond in healing and craft healing in imagining, right? Reimagining. What if you could reimagine the idea that you weren't with a loved one when they passed, but could you imagine the idea and share with the cells in your body? Could you imagine what it would be like if that evening that they passed, that you actually did show up at the hospital and you actually did come next to them and be able to say all of the things that you hope to say, and maybe got in bed with them and got close and were able to do all of those things. I think sometimes that reimagining that can really help us. The cells in our body don't know whether our loved one is earthly or otherwise. And so I always say, in that same idea of creating a continuing bond, the idea is that we can craft this relationship with them. So some folks say, I was in a fight with my dad when he passed, and now I can never resolve that. And that guilt, as you said, that lives in the body. So how can we resolve that? Maybe we write a letter to our loved one. Maybe we speak to them. I always say, those front seat conversations, I call them, right? When you're driving along, could you have a conversation with them? And then I believe that the body responds in healing because you craft this imaginal, real, depends on how you feel spiritually about that. But you can actually make amends. You can't change the outcome, but you can meet it. Claire Bidwell Smith is someone who I work with and study with. She's a therapist who has beautiful books on anxious grief. And in her anxious grieving book, a gentleman does just that. He shows up with these panic attacks and he has no idea how to resolve the unresolvable in his mind's eye. And so he's in tremendous pain, tremendous angst, tremendous anxiety. And she says, write to him, write to him. And the way that our body responds in that, it's a grief tending tool, writing, right? We know also good, juicy brain science that the body, the part of our brain that we use when we write by hand, also responds in healing. The prefrontal cortex. I'm not going to spout brain science to Dr. Roshanak because I would never, but I do suggest to all of my clients that they find writing as a practice because that connection is so beautiful, especially when, NJB is saying, yeah, the grieving process does not end. And so I am curious about manifesting negative crap because I can imagine negative feelings. But sometimes I think what I do talk about with clients is, even though we know that the process of along the way is we will all grieve something, as you said, right at the start of the show. The idea that something bad can happen to us may be a construct that we didn't even understand when we were kids, right? Maybe it wasn't explained to us. Maybe it was kept hush-hush from us when like a grandparent died. Or a pet, you were told that a family pet went to like a beautiful farm somewhere. And then you find out later that that wasn't the truth, that the dog in fact died. That, there are a lot.
And doesn't that involve also betrayal when you find out that you were lied to? That's a whole nother.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So what we know about death and dying may not be something that we learn until we have that first experience. Perhaps it's a sudden loss, perhaps it's an out of order, right? A
Yeah.
younger person. And so we know bad things can happen and we can believe they will from that day forward happen again. So when you say manifest bad shit, maybe it's just an awareness or crap, excuse me. Maybe you can imagine when we all say, like, when the phone rings after 10 o'clock at night, it's probably not great news. If we have had some unexpected loss in our life, an out of order death, which means maybe it wasn't an elder person that we expected was in their 90s or 100, and we expect that is the course of nature. If it's an out of order loss and this is a bad thing happened, then our brain says, ooh, a bad thing can happen again, right?
Especially if you don't get those late night call. Well, I mean, for me, 10 o'clock's not late. My friends call all hours, but that's why I don't panic if I get a call. I didn't make that association. So
Right.
something really powerful happened. And then you now associate that, and it's called a trigger. You associate that with something else, like the phone ringing. So there was a loss, the phone rang at 11 o'clock at night. So now every time, and normally you don't get those calls so late. So now every time the phone rings late at night, you go, it can only be bad news. And that connects to trauma, right? You were traumatized. And so if you haven't fleshed out and processed that trauma, then you're also going to be in that state. So we know from trauma that we are still in that time space of when the trauma happened, unless it's been processed. So there are triggers that will really bring that back up for us. And if you see these, what seem to be unexpected or unreasonable responses or actions, you're like, what's wrong with that? Because they're not here now, they're there then,
Right.
right? And so it really is incredibly important. And people are like, oh, I'm getting triggered, but it's part of losing that association in the brain to create new pathways for that. Let's say the phone ringing is to have tell your friends, can you call me later? Until your brain remaps that a phone ringing isn't bad news. But I love what you said, because it's this sort of, I expect the other shoe to drop, but life is full of things that you're going to think are good and think are bad. And actually, whether you think they're good or bad is also going to change over time. Right. And then, so you're just mapping that meaning to this event, saying, I've manifested bad things, right? If I understood you correctly, that's what you're saying.
Yeah. So he's saying manifesting negative crap is in, we lived in a hotel for the last year since the older sister died. Yeah. And almost everything didn't get better. Yeah. And also I think we believe that we are going to get over the loss of a loved one. And Dr. Roshanak and I had a conversation. I believe that we learn to live with loss. I don't think that there is any over. Hope Edelman calls it the long arc of grief. She wrote about motherless daughters, and she went back to them after 30 years and went back to the very same women that she had interviewed in her book, Motherless Daughters. And when she wrote The Long Arc, she went back to see, what does it look like over time? And as you become older, you may also meet the grief and the understanding of grief and the other experiences that you have had, right? Every time the phone rings, it is not always bad news, right? We're not always catastrophizing when the phone rings
Right.
at 10 o'clock. We make sense of the idea that that doesn't always mean bad news. Or, as you said, we tell our friends, don't call me then, because that's not really a good time to call me.
But then that keeps you in that only one triggered event, right?
Yes, yes. And I think what we also do, we were just talking about this, grief boundaries, I call them. If you know that you have an association and it will create re-grief or a heightened sense of a reckoning on a reckoning, if you will. You had grief, something else bad happens, you feel that grief or that unprocessed grief or that unprocessed part of an emotion that has not completed its cycle, you will feel that again and experience re-grief. It can bring you right back to maybe, the 30-year ago loss, and you feel that all over again. So I understand what it feels like to feel as if you are the catalyst to making bad things happen, that you are manifesting bad news. Perhaps you are catastrophizing. Maybe that is your answer, like more bad things are sure to happen, has been a way of dealing with the loss. I don't know the details of the story, but I do want to say, yes, condolences.
A little bit further up, you'll see that he was writing about some of that. So I'll say something while you read that.
Yeah.
And this is true, that could be, connected in this particular case to these unfortunate deaths. I'm so sorry, NJB. But we also can be like, have a superstition, right? That maybe I lost my job when somebody said or did something, or I walked under a ladder, or, whatever it is. And so the fact, there's a great book by Dr. Stephen Post, Why Good Things Happen to Good People, because they do. We always say things like, oh, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? Well, bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people as well. So it's not that you're manifesting necessarily, I would say, something that is bad but if you have that bias towards something bad is going to happen, then you can quickly connect that and say, well, I did this. And that may be connected to some unprocessed trauma for sure, some guilt, some whatever else there is. And I think that it is important, however, to recognize, and I was saying this earlier, about the power that we have and the energy that we put out into the world. And this comes not from a place of woo-woo at all, but from biology and psychology and science. And so when you are in a particular state, let's say you're in a good state, let's say something great happened, and then we have studies that show this, that when you're in that great state, then you tend to be more patient, more understanding, more compassionate of other people, right? It changes how you behave. Our brain state connects to our body and vice versa. It's not I mean, our brain is in our body, so it's just the central servo. And so this powerful connection between the brain, the heart, the gut, etc., the rest of the body. So we change our behavior based on our state. And so it could also be that when you're in a more negative state, when you're in a more positive state, if you're more patient, compassionate, understanding, etc., then you're not in that state, then you're less so that way. And that can also have consequences. And so being able to grieve, and as you said, and I'd love to talk about this a little bit too, Barry, you talked about permission to grieve and how people are so grateful to you because you give them permission to grieve, where they just, I'm going to let you talk about that. But what that means to us when we're able to take a breath and release and move into a different state, into greater alignment and closer into that remapping and that restructuring of what will work for us today. Barry.
I feel like what we're looking for is movement forward, right?
Yeah.
And movement can be tears, movement can be journaling, movement can be breath work, like you said. Just
very important.
Taking a deep breath. I always say breath on board, right? That's a tool that you always have. And it's an interesting construct because it is something that we don't have to control. We are breathed, the body breathes for us, but that we can control. And sometimes just having that control over our breath makes us feel like we have control of the situation. Breath work in grief is so eminently important. If you feel triggered, if you feel a heightened sense of anxiety, breathing in and out through the nose and extending the exhales, humming. We talked about, you and I talked about the vagal nerve, the vagus nerve.
Right. So you activate the parasympathetic system when you hum, when you sing, when you take a deep breath, right? And that parasympathetic nervous system, it's like the gas and the brakes, right? When you're stressed. And I also want to hear from you, because you're now sort of touching upon that a little bit, Barry, about the idea of stress on stress. So we have the stressor of the loss and then the stress of others' expectations or our expectations of how we're supposed to handle it. Right. So I would love to talk about that too. But that distress, that state of distress, has an activation of the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system that would have our physiology change and that's like putting your foot on the gas, and that's the fight or flight or collapse of the nervous system, faint, fawn, freeze. And when we take a deep breath, we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is like the brakes, and our body changes. Mine changed immediately. You can see my tone of voice, the cadence, all of that, the volume changed. I didn't do it consciously. I didn't do it intentionally. But even one deep breath, I just want to emphasize the importance of our biology to our lives and our mental, emotional states. It's not magic. We are one integrated being. And so understanding the ways that things happen within us, how the inside affects the outside and how the outside affects the inside, is very important. It's non-trivial. It's what we call non-trivial in science. That means it's really important. It has an effect.
Body experience. We don't realize that.
Right. It's that mind, body, spirit experience. Exactly.
And our somatic state, right, can really affect the way in which we show up in our grief.
Yes.
So I love that you brought up the breath work. There was a study that showed even that chanting Om increases the nitric oxide in your body, like something like 1,400%. And the blood flow to the brain and that, like all of these delicious things. And what I think about that is like in that moment of being able to let the body know I am okay. That's what I think of as a full deep breath. That's what I think of when we use the hum and we're telling the body I am okay, right? Sometimes we think we have to do something super elaborate in the grieving process in order to help us calm the nervous system. And it can be as simple as a deep breath. Sometimes I say, put your hand on your heart. Where is the breath? Is it in your belly? Is it high up here in your chest? Is it very shallow? Is it deep? Could I take a few deep belly breaths when I feel like my grief has reignited, or I feel like I'm in a grief state, when I feel like I'm in a heightened sense of emotions? Um, I see, yeah, mental, it can be exhausting. Grief can be so exhausting. And we don't give ourselves, because we are so eager to get over it. And also, um, in this capitalistic society, we are also asked to return to work. Uh, let's say your office gives you no days off, perhaps bereavement leave policy says, I have 3 days off. Anybody who has experienced a loss knows that, first of all, it's not enough time only to um, process your grief, but you can barely make funeral arrangements or some kind of remembrance. And so I always say the idea that society wants us to return to work so quickly, the message that we get is that you should be over this. The message sometimes that we get from family members, from loved ones, when we are still grieving after a period of time that they deem okay, normal, normative, we get these messages, and um, we think we are doing something wrong. Sometimes we pick up a book, a self-help book, if you will, on grief and grieving, and we read something and it sounds prescriptive, and we're looking for a way that we can move forward in our grief, and we read something and we feel like we're doing it right or wrong. There are many tools, but I say try them on and see what works for you, because the way that you calm your nervous system, the way that you remember your loved one, the way that you move forward is only for you to decide.
So I was just putting in the chat. Thank you so much for that. I was just putting in the chat, which is quite active, especially on YouTube. NJB was talking about, how do we stop that? Things coming up, songs and tears come all back again. And, sound and smell are very powerful triggers for our memories, and memories are incredibly important in the grieving process, right? So when a song comes up, it will take us somewhere. And that could be, remembering a best friend or some time at school or whatever. But when we've lost somebody and a song comes up that is a trigger, then of course that memory will come up. And as I had said earlier, pain is something that occurs in the brain when we lose someone, the death of somebody, a loss. And so, of course, now you are experiencing that loss again, and it is going to be painful. And then, of course, our natural mechanisms have us crying, which is not a bad thing at all. In fact, it's great. Your nature is a miser. If you didn't need to cry when you were sad, you wouldn't have those tear ducts and that pathway. So this is a very important natural biological process. It's also a psychic release of that negativity, and we need to release whatever it is that is hurtful to us. That hurt in and of itself isn't, however, depending on how we're defining it, bad. We are incredibly powerful, bio spiritually, to be able to manage sort of the slings and arrows that come at us. But if we don't allow for the processing, that, like chronic stress, because it is, causes things like inflammation in the body and all sorts of other processes that are incredibly damaging. So, and also for the brain, you start to you stop neurogenesis for the areas like the hippocampus, for example. You have a weakening of connections between different brain areas if there is a prolonged grief. So I want to be able to sort of parse out what becomes healthy and what becomes unhealthy, and being in a state that is really powerfully in the throes of that connection of the attachment still to the time space, and isolating yourself during that process is what can cause this neurobiological undesirable change. But having a song come up and trigger something, or having being in a place that reminds you, or eating a food, those memories can bring you back to a state of missing somebody and being sad for that loss. But I would differentiate that from what might be like a pathological response. And I would love for you, Barry, because I don't want to step on what I know you're so much better at than I am, this process of going through understanding and managing grief.
I was reading in the comments, and what I wrote back about that song is, of course, it brings up memories and feelings of pain and missing our person. But also, I think if you can move through that, you can sort of, I say, titrate, right? I don't want you to, sit in pain that feels like overwhelm. And someone's saying this triggered some memories of loss of grandparents. This will come up because we're giving it space and place, and we need to be witnessed, seen, heard, and understood in our grief. And so sometimes a song, I always say, or some writing about the person, I say, that helps us witness our own grief. So I even encourage sometimes making a playlist of songs that remind you of your loved one, and be with it for a little while, maybe even setting a timer to explore what it feels like to be with grief, to be in what I say grief tending mode, right? Just like you would weed and water a garden, when we don't tend to our grief, right? We turn the radio off because we don't want to hear that. We've shut off our ability to be moving through. And that's when the grief gets stuck, right? And we don't have movement forward. And if you keep stuffing that down and stuffing that down and stuffing that down because you are trying to make it over, it will come and find you. It will come out sideways in pain, anger, suffering, all ways in which, as you were saying, the definition of healthy, not healthy, we need to sometimes be with sadness, and getting comfortable with what is uncomfortable is a very large part of being with grief. I also think that being with others that understand, I saw a few of you saying that folks don't understand my grief. Being with those who do understand, where you can have a safe conversation about bringing up your loved one's name. Many have been silenced. If we don't say grandma's name, then this will be over. And the truth is that it just makes it something that feels shameful, or causes you guilt because you want to remember them and you are not able, or you can't find places and spaces where you can remember them. I love that someone was saying writing and breathing and writing leverages the process to help you move forward. These are the tools that help you to process. Sometimes we don't have the words, and we don't even have places to have discussions. Maybe you find a grief group. Maybe you find a grief support group. Some people think after the first year that it's too late. It is never too late to grieve a loved one. People, like I said about the long arc of loss, people learn to meet their grief to the best of their ability at the time of the loss, but then we can keep meeting it to the best of our ability over time. Maybe we are older. Maybe we have a better understanding of what happened. Maybe we've experienced other losses. Someone was saying this reminds me of the loss of my grandmother, now that I'm talking about another loss. Like you've tapped in there, right? You've tapped in. I think if you find that you are not getting over it, or you're waiting for your loved one to walk through the door, you haven't formed that natural sense of acceptance, that is when you should seek counseling. Sometimes we have a response to the trauma that makes us brings us to a state that we are not dealing with emotions. Maybe the brain and body are protecting us. They're doing natural, normal things to protect us from such pain. We think we are maybe in the midst of some danger, and it protects us. Sometimes we lose memory around the death of a loved one, depending on how we lost them. And so that's when you seek clinical intervention. There are many ways forward. There's EMDR, there's hypnosis, we could get into a long, lengthy conversation about the studies that have been done on psychedelics and how they are helping to folks who have prolonged grief. I don't think grief is something to fix necessarily. I think it is something that if you don't feel like you are meeting it, accepting it, acknowledging it in a way over time feels healthy to you, that is a good time to seek support.
I love that. One of the things that becomes that I was thinking of while you were saying this is this idea of the phantom limb, you know? And when you hear something, what it does is it sort of reactivates the maps that we had when, like when your limb was there, you have this, the mapping is still active, thinking that there's a limb there. You want to scratch it, but there's nothing to scratch, right? And the work of Ramachandran, which was amazing, was to just have what's known as a mirror box, because nobody could figure out what was going on with phantom limbs and what do we do and how do we address that. And there can be so much pain with that. And all you do is you have a mirror that shows the limb that you have mirroring. So you see the other limb. So your brain says, oh, there it is. And we can fool our brains.
Yeah.
And then you scratch that limb. And now you've got the relief because your brain, it doesn't matter if it's quote unquote physically real or not. It's how you're perceiving it.
And that's such a beautiful example, because that is, you could be in the grocery store and you feel so undone because the pickles that your mom loved so much when you go down the aisle, like, takes you out. You feel like, I cannot believe that I am trying to do this simple task of grocery shopping. And that is so upsetting. Someone said the other day that their home growing up, smelled like cigarette smoke and marinara. And she said, first of all, I told her that is the name of her memoir, because she's a writer, somebody that is the best title of a memoir ever. But she said, those are things that in the beginning, like, it was really hard for her to be in situations. She says, now I use the recipe. I use my mother's recipe for her marinara, and I honor her when I make the same marinara sauce that she did. So sometimes when I was talking about, like, the overwhelm of that feeling because it's unexpected, right? We don't know that it's coming, the song on the radio. Sometimes that makes you feel like it's actually a sign from a beloved. You'll be driving along and it will just come at a perfect time. Someone will say, I heard that song on the radio and I kind of knew on my way to that, job interview that, like, mom was with me,
Right.
heard that song and it was good. So sometimes it brings along some sadness, but all of it brings along remembrance. And that's what you were talking about earlier. It puts us in connection with our loved one. And so sometimes it's something that can make you sad, but can also make you quite happy. Do you make their recipes? Do you wear maybe a piece of their clothing? Sometimes somebody will, their mom loved theater. I'm going to bring my mom's purse to the theater. I'm going to wear their pearls on my wedding day. How we decide to move forward with these memories is a choice that we can make. When we are surprised that a song makes us sad, sure, of course, it helps you. You're in that space and it might have been unexpected, but also somewhere down the road, you might make, like, mom loved Barry Manilow, so I'm going to make that Barry Manilow playlist, and I'm going to be with all the songs that help me remember mom. Maybe there's, clients always ask me, they're coming up to a big celebration, like a wedding, and they're going to always imagine that the future of their wedding would be like that first dance, or dad walking them down the aisle, or, the way that you envisioned that carrying out, and you have to make something new. Maybe it is then that song feels like a true comfort, something that they loved and admired becomes part of a practice that you have. Like I said, a grief tending playlist. There are smells and sensations that will come, and they will take you by surprise. You will be surprised that they bring you back to your grief, right? Just when I thought I was over it, there I was in the grocery store.
Right.
For me, that sometimes is seasonally. My mother loves Santa Rosa plums, and they come but once a summer. And I know on the last day of her life, from a receipt from the A&P, that she ate 3 pounds of Santa Rosa plums on her last day. When I see them come in the grocery store, I often remember her, and some years it makes me sad, and other years it makes me fill up my bag to the tune of three times, where I put it on the scale just to remember exactly what it was like that she had. And I am now able to do that. So you have to also check in with yourself. How is it making me feel? Check in with your body. How is it showing up? What feels like nurturance? What feels like when I write in my journal? Does it feel good? I always say, note on the top of the page, not just the date, but how I feel when I'm entering this writing. 4 minutes, maybe you put on the clock. Set a little timer. How do I feel when I start? How do I feel when I end? Just checking in with yourself. Maybe just a one-word check-in, a somatic check-in. How do I feel? And then how do I feel when I exit this activity? Sometimes it's a run. Sometimes it's a walk. Sometimes it's yoga. Sometimes it's meditation. Folks say sitting still in meditation is nearly impossible for them. And others say it feels so good to get quiet and be with my thoughts. So again, everybody's looking for like that fix. Like, can someone give
Magic bullet, as it were.
yeah,
Right.
can someone give me the way that I can get over this? Because good news, bad news, there's no recipe, but there also is no right way or one way. And so I say, what feels good to you? Can you trust that you know? Can you trust that you know? And the relationship that we had to the person that we lost is so different than even the person in our family had. So we may have all lived under the very same roof.
Right.
We're all having a different experience because our experience with that loved one, our love with that loved one, our maybe unresolved business with that loved one, maybe our emotional attachment to that loved one, they're all different. So your grief will be different too.
I love that. We're already over time. It went so fast. We knew this was going to happen. So,
Or non-death loss, because we moved really quickly into all the death loss. But I also want to say sometimes you need to name grief for yourself in a non-death loss too. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe you've lost a partner. Maybe you've gotten a divorce, sobriety. Maybe you've lost a friend. Maybe they're very much still alive, but you are figuring out how to manage without them in your life. Perhaps a diagnosis. Any day in which you can imagine that there was sort of a before and an after.
does that also apply to jobs?
Yes, job loss, absolutely. Or, maybe you didn't get the promotion. All of it can be like a life you imagined and the way that would play out and how the reality sits with you. And so I say some of it needs to be grieved, and you can name that a time. That's where the permission granted comes in, where you can name that a time of need for healing and name it grief and grieve that loss. Also,
How can we grieve that loss? I know it's very personal and it's different for everybody, but what could be some strategies for that?
I think that telling someone that you're grieving the loss, even saying it aloud and being witnessed, telling someone I'm grieving the loss of the job I didn't get. Can someone witness that? Can someone bear witness to that? I think it's a big deal. I think when you say it out loud, I also think when you see writing outside of yourself, you separate yourself from what you're feeling on the inside and seeing it outside of yourself. I think it's a beautiful way to accept the loss yourself. I think ritual, right? What can I do that would feel really good for me to name this space for grieving? Like I said at the beginning of our of our talking, people are having ceremony for the end of marriages. The ex-husband, the ex-wife may be very much alive out there in the world, but there's a
Right.
part of the future that you imagine for you, for your children, that needs to be grieved. Maybe we're putting that to rest, and the only way that we can move forward is with that, not just that acceptance, but some kind of a ritual that can be witnessed ourselves, and maybe you invite along someone that can witness it with you.
One of the things that happens, I'm just going to throw a little neuroscience in there. And we were talking earlier about catastrophizing. So there's an area of the brain called the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, and that's where rumination occurs. That's, we have thoughts. We have tens of thousands of thoughts every day, and like 95% of them are repetitive. And I believe that's the number. And I'm sorry, yeah, are repetitive, and 80% are negative. This is the more or less statistic that's around there. And those negative thoughts that we have over and over and over and over again are rumination. And that goes into this, that's connected very powerfully. And we see activation in this area called the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. Remember I spoke about the brakes and the gas before? There's another example of that. So that's this emotional sort of spinning that's going on when we have these repetitive thoughts that are ruminating that can lead to catastrophizing. And for those of you who don't know, catastrophizing is like you go on a first date, doesn't work out, and then you go, I'll die alone. One bad date is like, oh my God, nobody loves me. So it's not like that, but that's catastrophizing. And it's making a catastrophe out of something. And so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is an area that gets activated when we journal because it is considered thought. You now go from this emotional state to this I'm thinking about it state. And
Mhm.
that's really important for bringing you into a different, literally, state of being. And for being able to find a better balance between the emotional and the logical centers, or between executive functioning and emotional functioning, and as it were. And so when we do things like, the writing or the breathing, that when you breathe in through your nose, it gets a greater oxygenation. You can breathe out through your mouth. It doesn't matter, breathe out through your nose, but the breathing in through the nose is where you get that increased oxygenation. And so the humming, the singing, the chanting is activating the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve, and all these different ways that you can now start to find a better balance. I believe, Barry, that's what you're talking about, is this modulation of this and that brings us into a greater balance, one that works for us to be, well functioning. And I love that you bring that up, because I find that to be really the answer to it all. That's how you have these different strategies that help us. And yet there is no one way, because everybody's set point is different, because life is dynamic, because it changes for us all the time. And like I might be in a place where I want to connect to my pain and my grief, right? And that, even though it's very sad, is also very rewarding. So it's our reward centers that we're talking about, not pleasure. People think dopamine is about pleasure. Dopamine is about seeking and getting that reward. And that's why grieving is a motivational process, right? So when we're talking about the different ways in which we might be able to manage what's happening at different times, different things might be helpful for us depending upon what we are seeking for. What do you think about that, Barry?
Oh, I mean, that is brilliant. And I think knowing the science behind what is happening to us as we are grieving, is important. That's why I love all the way that you and I riff back together, because
It's
when
a
we,
good balance.
yeah, someone was just saying that it helps tell others that we are grieving. We we don't really do that in our society. We used to live like so close to one another that it was almost like the neighbor would absolutely know the business of the family if you had experienced a loss. Now we're meant to walk into a job and do all the stuff that we're doing on the regular and be a grieving person. Now that could be a breakup, right? It could be a lot. That loss could be a breakup. Your coworkers might not know, but you had an interview for something else and you show up and you had not gotten the promotion. All of those things are grief and grieving. So who is the person that you can go to where your grief can be witnessed? Or where can you allow yourself to sit in, like you said, the sadness, right? If that is what works for you, to allow for yourself to be able to process. We just don't have the commonality, right? We don't have, can you imagine if we were all wore on our shirt all of what ails us, right? If we could call in to work and say, calling in griefy today, it's the 1 anniversary of the death of my mother. And, we could call in with a cold, we could, but we don't say, I am 2 years
We
later,
don't do that.
or 4 years later, today is the death anniversary of the loss of my mother, and today I am grieving. How beautiful would it be, and how acceptable, if it were acceptable, to just call in griefy. I think if you can find ways that you can even call in for yourself a trusted friend, a grief support group, a writing group, a yoga class, where can you be that you will feel like you have place and space to be with your grief, where it is not held a secret, it is not shameful, but it is actually a place where you can be with your grief, to companion your grief.
I love that you brought in the word shame, because people can shame you for being sad after a year, 5 years, 10 years of the loss of something or someone. But that future that you were talking about, Barry, that is real to us, and it is painful to us, and it's it's holy, and nobody has the right to say to you, I'm sorry, nobody has the right to shame you when you are feeling this sadness. We might care for someone else and be concerned and want to support them, but that is different than shaming them. And I
Yeah.
really love that you brought that up. And we had 2 episodes ago, this incredible conversation with Dr. Natalie Martinick, whom you know, very. We've all three of us worked together. An epic conversation on shame. And she is quite the expert on shame. And she writes about it, she talks about it, she teaches about it. And she said this is the best conversation she'd ever had on shame. So my video was terrible. I fixed it. So if you want to listen to it rather than watch, because it can be distracting with the video freezing, but it is an incredible episode about the different aspects of shame and how it can creep in. And so here with this conversation, we're having this incredibly important conversation on grief, Barry, the idea that someone can shame you, which is of course also stressful, and puts us in such a negative state, where we're already in this pained state, and someone comes along and maybe meaning well, or maybe unconsciously, because or unknowingly, they don't know any better, they will say to you,
Truth. They don't know any better, and they may
any better.
for you to no longer be in pain. Sometimes it comes with like so much goodness. They really don't want to see you in pain. So
Exactly. They love you, but they're not expressing it properly. They don't have the tools, and that's what this conversation is great for. Take it away, Barry.
yes, no, I think quite often when you've been through a loss, good, bad, or indifferent, you become a beacon for others. You say, this is what helped me. That is not helpful to me. You need to be a light for others. So I say, if you can even go forward and help one person by asking the name of their loved one, what is her name? If you can say, jot down when someone passes the date of the death anniversary, and check in with them, put it on your calendar and check in with them next year. Check in with them after the funeral. How are you? Just checking in. If you can
I just had a friend do that.
if you can,
Literally, she had it on her calendar. Donna, I'm shouting you out. And she, a couple of days in advance, said, I know this is coming up. She didn't even wait till the day of. She said, a couple of days in advance, she said, I know this is coming up. How are you doing? She was very supportive. She was just the fact that she was present for me, and that brings more connection and safety to us, right?
Thinking of you. And we're taping this with Father's Day is around the corner, and that can be a really difficult time for folks, whether they're estranged, whether they've lost their dad, whether they are having difficulty becoming a dad. Just being sensitive. If you can think of one way that you could be that person that makes this time a little bit easier for somebody, check in. So if it helps just one person by what you know about the way that you experience the world, experiencing your grief versus the way that you wished that you had been treated, if you can be that beacon for somebody else. I always say I feel like Grief's hype girl, Grief's PR girl, she really needs some better PR. You can be part of that mission to make grief part of the daily vernacular. Climb on board. We all need a better way of gathering around the campfire and being witness to the best parts and also the hardest parts of one another's lives. It's the most human experience to experience death and loss. And I think if we can be more open to the not so celebratory parts of being with someone in sadness, sometimes if you have that capacity of just sitting and allowing, be that person. You don't have to do much. There's nothing much to do, but just be a compassionate and active listener and just sit with them a little bit in the muck. Allow for it. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing when you find somebody that you don't have to hide it from, but that you can actually be with them in their grief and in the remembering of their person and in, embracing the suck, if you will, is one of the hardest parts. It's a phrase that they use in the military, embracing the suck. And I think sometimes that's all you need to do. Embrace the suck. It won't be comfortable. It won't be pretty. It might not be pretty, but it will help you get through at this very moment, and whatever that means for you.
And what you're talking about, Barry, you really described empathy.
Oh,
Empathy is not that you're feeling what someone else is feeling. Empathy is holding that space, as you call it, right? Just being present and so let me give a new definition of what holding space is, so that so many people are like, holding space, what does that mean? It means you are present and connected to the other person, actively listening to what they're saying and what they are feeling. You are aligned with them. Let's go back to some neuroscience. Storytelling. When somebody is speaking, like Barry was, and I was deeply listening to her, then areas in her brain that are active are also active in my brain. This is not mirror neurons. This is different brain regions. As she's going through what she's feeling when she's speaking, I'm going through that as well. I'm getting that. So, like you go to the beach, it's beautiful, it's sunny, you call your friend, and what do you say to get them to understand your experience? It's called feature abstraction. You talk about the sun and the breeze and the temperature and all the different features of the scene. That's one way to communicate. And empathy, holding space, is I'm listening. I hear and I receive and I'm present and aligned to you. When you feel really good, you call your friend and you share news and they're really there and they're also super happy for you. It's great. When you're really sad, you call your friend and you're really upset and they get it. You feel better. The science shows that when you're upset and when you're talking to someone who has empathy and holding space for you, you literally change the activation. Your brain changes, your body changes, and you literally feel better. It's a decrease of that pain and discomfort, etc., that you were feeling. It's real. It's been shown, and we've all experienced it. So
the cook cooks. So not all of us are the person that
right,
sit down with you and be empathetic.
right.
Stirs up something in us that we don't have the capacity for. So if you are not that person, by all means, go, cook the casserole, drop off, show up as your most authentic self.
Yeah, there's no shame in saying to someone, I can't hold that space for you right now. That is a gift and a blessing, because the science also shows if I'm like trying to be nice and I'm like, okay, I'll listen, but I don't have time and I'm distracted. That person, after they're done talking to you, literally feels worse. And we've experienced that too, right?
Yeah.
So The kind thing to do is to be honest and say, I can or I cannot do this. Let's take shame out of the equation and bring love and truth back in. And this is what it looks like, that I love me and I love you. I have empathy for me and I have empathy for you. I have compassion for me and I have compassion for you. I don't like self-love, self-compassion. It's just love and compassion. We're all in there together, right? So
Yeah.
I love that you just said that, Barry. I love it. I love it. I love it. So good.
And Jacob says he's absolutely calling in griefy. I love that.
I love it.
Permission granted. Permission granted.
I thought I heard you say griefy with a
Yeah.
Y. I'm like, I'm calling in griefy. And I'm like, whoa. It's almost like having, because also, we all talk to ourselves, but having a third person, like having that, like Kobe Bryant did this, and Beyonce did this. And there are so many who have this third person persona, that instead of speaking to myself as me, they have this third person. What's great about that is it takes the emotion out of the equation, that emotion that blocks us. And so you can say, so that you're connecting to your grief without drowning in it, and being able to share that in a way that doesn't make you feel too vulnerable, so that you have your, boundaries, as we like to say. Saying that there's like griefy, I'm calling in griefy, I'm calling in as this third person persona that allows me to be present to everything that's going on without getting drowned into all of that, so that then I can make that space that I need to move forward in a way that works for me, without first foot out, boom, I'm getting hit with like all of it all at once, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love
I
that.
love that.
Jacob says, gotta write down empathy equal holding space for you. It's so beautiful. I love that you explained that. You were such a good storyteller. And
Well, I like to say that I explain the science behind the woo-woo,
yes,
because it makes it tractable. It's not that these things are wrong, but if we can't really understand them, if they're not tractable to us, then how are we supposed to stay connected with that? How are we supposed to use those tools and understand which strategies are best with those tools, or any tools, if we don't have a deep understanding of it, right?
yeah, and
We think we understand in the moment, but then it's not sustained.
showing up for one another with the assumption, not not what not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
Yeah.
We're all experiencing losses and micro losses day in and day out. We're living in a world right now that is really confusing, and it may be stirring up a lot of collective grief, a lot of communal,
And trauma.
you know, uh, we may be, some of our own unprocessed grief may be coming up at this time. And so if we can just meet each other with a whole lot of compassion and love and understanding, just know that we are all likely grieving something, whether it is today or something in our past. And so I'm hopeful that, that we can just all bring a little more humanity and empathy to one another's lives. Whenever I'm in traffic and someone's doing like crazy things or laying on the horn, I'm like, oh, that person's grieving and that person's grieving. It helps me to better understand, like the barista is sour. I'm like, yeah, I wonder what happened to them. So
I love that.
what comes from this conversation, I hope that everybody feels hopeful. Often I say, I'm a hope dealer. That if you can just lighten the load for somebody by being a compassionate listener, thank goodness, because we need to be witnessed in grief. And if you have the space and now you have a little better understanding, and also if you know that somebody has lost a loved one, ask them for a story. They're not going to be more sad about, they're not going to forget that they've lost a loved one by you bringing up their name. Ask them for a story, or tell them a story about the loved one that they might not know. And if you are eager to get in touch with your grief and you're not certain how, ask those around the person that you've lost for a story about them. Sometimes it feels so good to know your person as a 360-degree person. I remember asking folks about stories that people that worked with my mom. I only knew her as a mom, but she was so much more in the world. And that often just feels so beautiful to hear reflected back to you. something about a loved one. Ask for a note, ask for a letter. People will say to you, what can I do for you? And it's so open-ended and you don't even know what you need at the moment. Ask for a story. Ask them to write it down for you so that you have it and you can revisit it on a time when it feels good to you, maybe on the anniversary.
I love that. Thank you so much. So we are very much over time and there's so much to discuss here. I do love what you were talking about with the cognitive reframing. I think that's really important. It's also an important way to address anger is to reframe. Like I do that too. You know, you could have road rage, but if you sit there and you think, well, that person has something really important going on. Maybe there's an emergency. This happened to me. I had someone in the back of my car. And they were actually in atrial fibrillation, and I was rushing them to the hospital. But they were lying down, and it was rush hour. So I was on the shoulder, weaving through traffic. I was, I'm rushing to the hospital because I want to make sure. I mean, at the time, they didn't necessarily know that they were an AFib. They were just having basically a heart attack is what they thought. And I'm like, oh my God. And so there you go. And so that cognitive reframing, let me be the example, isn't just you lying to yourself. It could very much be true. You know, by all accounts, I look like a crazy person by myself in a car. You didn't know, so there's someone lying in the back seat having a heart attack, right? So I always say, I don't know what that person's going through. They may be grieving. There's something going on. Whatever that something is, let me give them grace because I would want grace, right?
Yeah.
And so it keeps us from getting angry. It keeps us from being, thinking the worst.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Keeps us from being reactionary.
Yes.
Just us pause. Yeah, I love that. Someone said,
and so I love all of these things that we've brought up. I do want to spend the last minutes, and I hate to end this conversation because it's so good. And thank you. I want to give a shout out to my production team for being so amazing and always making time and space for us to be able to go long when we have these really important conversations. So Garth and Jim, shout out to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being so amazing all the time. I am so grateful. And so is everybody else who receives all this wonderful information that is meant to mindset, heartset, reset, share the authentic stories, give the tools, share the knowledge, and then we get the courage to hit the reset button on our lives. So thank you to you, Barry, for staying long. Thank you to Garth and Jim for always being here and taking care of us and giving us such great production, high quality. I want to ask you, Barry, we do have a get off the couch moment. So first of all, before we get to the get off the couch moment, is there anything you think that we should bring forth? Did you have an opportunity to finish discussing other kinds of grief, job loss, breakup, divorce, recovery, etc.? Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about that?
I just think
how to handle that.
Yeah, well, we diminish those, we compare. And so I would say the worst thing that you can do is feel like your loss, because people say to me, what's the worst loss, right? Is it the death of a child? Is it, whatever? And I say the worst loss is your own. And so while you may perceive that there is something out there in the world that looks worse and you don't feel like you have permission to grieve because it might feel small, it's big to you. It's big to you. It changed your worldview. It changed the future that you imagined. It's big to you, even moving house. So I want you to feel like you have permission to name those non-death losses grief. And can you imagine a way to grieve those? As I said, people are having ceremony, ritual, just as if it were a rite of passage, that when these experiences don't turn out the way that you envisioned, that you stop and you take note. This is not what I imagined. This is not the future that I thought I would have. And I am grieving. Even naming it, grief, can be so important. And then, as I said earlier, can you find a way for that grief to be witnessed? Because when we are seen, witnessed, and understood, it can help us make ritual of the experience. We feel like we have named it. And sometimes I say, name it to tame it. And sometimes we just have to give it that air and breadth and depth that it deserves. And so a lot of us don't even know that a non-death loss can be grieved. So feel like you have that permission, that, and, and and I can't name every single one because that will be personal to you, but sometimes people are very surprised when I do name something. You know, the friendships that you lost in sobriety, maybe even maybe you're grieving the fun girl that you thought that you used to be before you found sobriety, maybe the loss of friends in sobriety. So there's like, even in something that feels very good and healthy and a great life change, even in that life change, you may lose something in the process, and feel as if you have permission to even seek support in a non-death loss, because there are those of us that are supporting those in circles, and in different kinds of therapy. And I hope you feel heard. I hope you feel heard today. That loss matters too.
Hi, thank you. Had a little technical difficulty there. So I put in the chat different links to connect with you. I've got the Substack, I've got the Memory Circle, I've got barrylinergrant.com. Is there anything else that we...
She's everywhere. She's everywhere. You know, I think at the Memory Circle is the best place to find me. It has a free grief relief kit that you can get just by hopping on the site. It's a little gift from me to you. It has tons of resources, lots of books that I love, podcasts that I love. I try to keep it a place you can tap in, and I update it at all times. My Instagram also my DMs are always open. So if there's a question that you have that was not answered today, please hop in. It's me on the other end of those answers.
Well, you have two Instagrams. Can you tell us which Instagram to contact you on?
The Memory Circle.
The Memory Circle. That's the one on Instagram as well, right? Excellent. All right. So let me ask you this, Barry, because we love to ask our guests, our amazing guests at the end of every show. What is the get off the couch advice you would give to people? So it's what we call our get off the couch moment. And it's what can somebody do? So people say knowledge is power. I say it's potential power. It's when you take action on your insights that now you have connected to that power. And so for anybody who's listening today, who's lost a job, who's lost a pet, who's lost a loved one, who is experiencing or has experienced a breakup, or any other kinds of loss, what can they do now? Get off the couch, as it were. What can they do now or in the next 24 hours that would help them to move through the processing of that loss in a healthy way, in a way that will get them into a better state of being?
I mean, I would say find community. I think the number one thing that we need to do is find community. There are so many free resources out there. Your local library, your church, your synagogue. There are so many folks out there who you can connect with. I think knowing that you're not alone in your grief is urgently important. So I would say finding community, souls who understand what it is that you've been through. And if being in a group is not comfortable for you, if there is a way to reach out to someone where you can find somebody who's experienced a similar loss, I think sometimes that helps us to just understand that we are not alone in this. And sometimes we see into the future by meeting somebody who is what I call on the other side, even if it's a little further in their rearview mirror than yours, that you can see hope. You can experience the hope that they are surviving this loss, and you will too.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. That's wonderful. So, all good things, all things, they change, right? So when it's difficult, this too shall pass. And when it's great, lean in and get all the love and joy out of it that you can. But for now, we are going to thank you so much, Barri Leiner Grant, for joining us, for sharing your time, your talent, your heart, and all your experience and expertise with us in understanding how to process loss. Thank you so much. So grateful to you.
So grateful to you. Thank you so much.
Also, so grateful to the audience. If you've joined us live, if you're on Facebook or on the private platform, or if you are on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us, whether it's the recording and you're listening after the fact or listening over and over, as some people do, because myself also, because there's so much. It's such a rich conversation. We invite you also to check out our other rich conversations on Mindset, Heartset, Reset. We have fantastic guests who come in and do just as Barri has done, share their authentic stories, their experience and expertise. Next week, we are super excited to have Swami Chinananda join us as we talk about the ladder of grief, and we continue on with the conversation about suffering and not getting into a space from the science and spiritual aspect of being able to prevent suffering, to be able to manage the steps along the way that might get us to a place where we would be suffering, where we misdirect ourselves or underestimate the power of a stage where we're unconsciously acting or not consciously taking advantage of the information that's available to us that would help us to make better decisions. So excited for that conversation, as well as we continue on this 2-month series on mental health, where we approach it from science and spirituality. We're very excited for people like Barri who come and join us and share with us and help us and support us. So thank you again, Barri. Thank you again, audience. I hope that you have a beautiful day and that this has been helpful for you. And do, as Barri has said, do in fact find people who understand you, who you can understand, be a beacon, receive the light. Namaste, everybody. God bless.